All right, we seem to have everybody who was here to begin with admitted, so I am going to hand things over to Michelle Eaton to officially open day 2. Michelle, take it away.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Eaton, and I'm Vice President of Public Affairs at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, everyone. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that while we meet in cyberspace, I'm coming to you from the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. So we're the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. We represent, for those of you who don't know, we represent 157 chambers of commerce and boards of trade across Ontario, and we have up to 60,000 members across the province. We're a members-based organization and provide services, supports, policy development, and advocacy on behalf of our members. So welcome to the Diversity in Business ROI Conference presented by the Discoverability Network. We're so delighted to host this 2-day conference to talk about the importance of inclusive hiring to workforce development and future economic prosperity. So today we're going to continue that learning journey that we all started yesterday. We heard some amazing, from amazing speakers yesterday, and we'll continue that today with some interesting inclusion experts and business leaders, those with lived experience about the importance of creating disability confident workplaces. So looking forward to another great session. I want to give a big thank you to the OCC staff who worked hard in planning today's this event this week. And just particularly to the staff that are in charge of our Discoverability Network. They work tirelessly to ensure that we are continuing to break barriers for persons with disabilities. Enormous thanks to our speakers. We had a fantastic group that joined us yesterday. Today will be no different. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Enormous thanks to the Government of Canada for their continuous support of the Discoverability Network. Thank you to our friends at Magnet for their partnership on the Discoverability Network program, our event partners, DSV Solutions, CBC, Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association are participating in a panel discussion today. Thank you to our employment service providers, WCG, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Live, Work, Play, and Toronto District School Board. And thank you, big thanks to all of you. Thank you to the employers and job seekers that have engaged with the Discoverability ability platform and that are joining for today's discussion. So grateful for this continued engagement. Our work as the indispensable partner of business is not possible without all of you. And a few things about the Discoverability Network, because I'm enormously proud of everything that we've accomplished. And the Discoverability Network continues to provide resources and training to help businesses become more inclusive and connect companies and persons with disabilities to meaningful employment. So by the end of 2021, they've trained close to 1,000 employers. They've registered almost 1,500 employers on their job matching platform. They've listed 3,000 job seekers on the platform. They've held over 400 events. They've partnered with 30 post-secondary institutions, over 50 employment service providers to provide training and workshops for staff and job seekers with disabilities. They continue to do incredible work, just so proud of the team. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce is dedicated to breaking down barriers to create more inclusive workplaces and improving labor market participation of persons with disabilities. So thrilled for today's discussion. And I just, before I wrap up, I just have to say, it's not one advocate or business or association or educational institution or government that can advance inclusion alone. We all must work together to build a future we can all thrive in. And that starts with conversations like we're having this week. So a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over back to Donald. If you have questions, put your questions in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks everyone for being here and being the change we need to see. If you're joining us on social media, and I encourage you to do so, please use the hashtag Diversity in Business 2022. And now I'll turn it over to my dear friend Donald again. Thank you. Hats off to you for your incredible work on the conference. Over to you, Donald.
Thank you, Michelle. We appreciate that wonderful opening. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for day 2, Maayan Ziv, CEO of Access Now. Maayan is an activist, photographer, and entrepreneur. In 2015, she launched Access Now, a mobile app and website that collects and shares information about the accessibility status of places worldwide. What began as a response to her frustration when trying to navigate inaccessible places, Access Now soon grew to become a mission-oriented social startup. Within just a couple years, Access Now has vocalized a movement for inclusion, inviting people of all abilities to contribute to the platform. As CEO of Access Now, Maayan has created a powerful shift in thinking about the importance of accessibility in our world, from accessible technologies to infrastructure, public policy, media, and communications. To date, Access Now has shared accessibility information in over 35 countries. An influential public speaker who is often in the media, Maayan collaborates with private sector companies as well as government and not-for-profit organizations. She is leading a movement, challenging norms, and empowering others to make the future accessible and inclusive for all. Maayan and her work with Access Now have received numerous awards, including Canada's Top 40 Under 40, the Governor General's Innovation Award, the City of Toronto Access Award, and the David C. Onley Leadership in Accessibility Award. Thank you very much, Maayan, for joining us. We would love to hear your thoughts on inclusive hiring as a tool for business growth and development. So please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Donald. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I'm really excited to share with you just some thoughts and remarks that, are really inspired by my own experience. Now that you have my almost too long bio, and I have to remember to never sit in on my own bio again. It's always a weird thing to listen to. I'm going to take you back to where it started. So, for me, I live in Toronto, and I grew up in a world that really was not designed for me. At a pretty young age, I realized that I was different. I was different than a lot of my friends and my family members, and I was different than a lot of the people that I was engaging with, teachers, service providers. And really what stood out the most was that there were certain things in my world that just really seemed to not reflect my needs and really missed the mark in terms of acknowledging the fact that, yes, I had a disability. I was born with muscular dystrophy. I've always used a wheelchair. And I remember growing up and looking around and not really understanding that it really was the environment that was disabling. And it wasn't really anything about how I was born or the disability that I had that was the issue. And I realized, probably in my teens, that there was a mismatch between my needs and the environment that I was just growing up in and navigating as kind of a young adult. And that was a really important distinction for me to make, because it helped me realize that there was nothing that I needed to do to make myself different or less disabled in order to engage with the world. And that really my biggest task would be in everything that I do, from going to school to looking for work to even just grabbing a cup of coffee with a friend, was really going to be centered about accessibility first. How can I find people who are open-minded enough to see me as me and not as something other? How could I engage in an environment that didn't have barriers so that I could just go about my day in my life? And how could I eventually just feel at ease and reduce some of the anxiety that I felt about constantly coming up against barriers? That's the world that I wanted to live in, and that's the world that I dream of today. And one of the ways in which accessibility specifically has shown up for me, is really in the built environment. Because I was born with a physical disability and I've always used a wheelchair, initially accessibility to me was defined as the things personal to me. I needed ramps as opposed to stairs. I needed elevators as opposed to stairs. I needed specific kind of features in the built environment. And growing up, that's what I was taught accessibility was about. And a lot of people feel that way. A lot of people think that accessibility really is just that, ramp instead of a stair or step at the front of a building. But in 2015, I did something that truly changed my life and completely shifted my understanding of accessibility forever. I decided that I didn't want to any longer be a consumer of services. I became a creator. I took kind of control of my experience navigating my world, and I decided to launch my own business. Now, I didn't go into it thinking I'm going to be a business owner. I didn't originally think this is, going to change my life forever, but I was just so motivated to solve my own problem, which was this constant frustration, the constant struggle that I experienced as a person with a disability anytime I left my house when it came to navigating any new space or any individual who might not really be familiar with the world of disability. I wanted answers. I wanted a platform that could give me simple answers about how accessible or how inclusive an environment could be. And that's how it started for me. I'll say that, entrepreneurship came quite naturally, actually, to me, because I've always had to think outside the lines. I've always had to remake or adapt or create new solutions because I've grown up in a world that was not prioritized or designed with my needs in mind. And so as I grew my business, that natural kind of need to recognize, okay, the first option isn't working, but here are 5 other ways to get the job done. As a business owner was so critical, and my strengths actually really came to light there. My constant need and experience as a person who would show up at an entrance and need to find, the side entrance or the back door, or convince, my friends on the playground to meet me somewhere else or do a different activity so that I could be included. Those skills as a younger girl and into my adulthood now all of a sudden had an opportunity to be put to a different use, as opposed to, maybe survival, but actually growing a business. And so that's what Access Now has really taught me about myself. So in short, if you're not familiar with Access Now, it's a company that I launched in 2015 in response to this specific need. I had no resources, no skills in technology. I did not know anything about what it means to run a business or start a business, but I had this need. So through the nature of just connecting with folks and asking questions and being curious and having a deep desire to solve a very personal problem, I developed a website and mobile app that showcases the accessibility of places around the world. And we do this in collaboration and partnership with people with lived experience of disability who share their personal experiences and reviews, rating businesses and public spaces on the Access Now app from the perspective of, accessibility first. So does this space, have an accessible entrance? Does it provide ASL interpretation, or are there Braille or digitally accessible menus at the restaurant? We have a very wide variety of the different types of accessibility that we feature. And it's entirely learned and driven by the community of people who say, these are our needs. This is what we look for when we speak about inclusive and accessible businesses. And we also work with business owners who have invested in accessibility or who are beginning their journey to understanding how to be more accessible, to highlight and showcase what offerings and services they have that can contribute to the lives of people who are looking for just that, greater independence and increased freedom. And so that's really what Access Now is about. It's about creating this ecosystem that collaborates between citizens, consumers, the government, business leaders, and anyone really who feels a desire to be part of a conversation and a movement for change. And along the way, I learned many lessons from thousands of other disabled people about what it means to engage in accessible, what it means to live an accessible life, what accessibility translates to within communities and neighborhoods and employment. And originally, although many people might expect that I was an expert on issues around accessibility, I was far from that. I was simply a consumer. I was someone who needed specific features to live my own life. And it was actually only when I took the role of being a founder and an entrepreneur that I began to understand how accessibility translates into meaningful inclusion for a diverse group of people with many different needs and experiences. Accessibility does mean different things to different people, and it is a journey, not a destination. And so understanding how it shows up for people within their home life, within their work life, within their community, and even, how they play is an incredible and empowering opportunity to kind of open your mind to how we can actually invest in more inclusive, diverse, and accessible spaces for people. So it's a lot more than just ramps. It's a lot more than just elevators. And in fact, employment, inclusive and accessible, I will say, employment is critical to achieving equity for people with disabilities. What I realized in kind of building my company and having the opportunity to connect with business owners and leaders is that many employers fail to kind of address that mismatch. The one that I spoke about, where, growing up, I realized my world, wasn't designed for me in mind. Many spaces of work are similar in that way. The way in which we define work and the capacity or the type of person we think is fit for work has not always been designed to include people who show up differently. There are a lot of stigma and stereotypes and, quite frankly, fears about engaging or employing people with disabilities, because for the longest time, people with disabilities have been underemployed or unemployed. And that is because there is this otherness or this difference that often non-disabled people don't know how to address. And I think it's really important to address it. I think, as we kind of grow into 2022 and 2023 and the future, we are hearing from people of many different backgrounds and experiences who have been marginalized, who have not had their needs and their perspectives heard. And through the use of technology and social media, we have begun to kind of unpack and highlight stories and narratives that are, not the norm that you hear in traditional media. This is an incredible moment, a shift in how we understand the diversity of human experiences. And I think disability is so integral to that fabric. Disabled people, as I have come to learn, are some of the most creative, agile, resilient, and often most loyal people that I have ever met in my own life. Because we have constantly needed to negotiate with our surroundings. And I can't speak for every person is different, but from my experience, because of those needs to negotiate, there is that flexibility when it comes to work as well. And when people are willing and able to work, it's so important as employers to be able to acknowledge those strengths and not to see them as deficits. It's really interesting. When I started my company really early on, I kind of got some press coverage. And what was really bizarre to me was that in the majority of the stories that I was kind of being shared about, there was this narrative of, despite her disability, she's launched a business, or despite her disability, she's defying the odds, or, Maayan has launched an app. And there's this concept of, even though she has a disability, look at what she's doing. And I thought that that was a real missed opportunity because I would read those stories and those articles and think, nothing in my world happens despite my disability. But actually, everything happens with it, and often informed by my disability. I would not have launched my company if it was despite my disability. I wouldn't have even thought to create this innovation if it was not for, all the years that I have had with lived experience of disability that informed my understanding of the world. Disability can be a strength. And in fact, I think it's an incredible opportunity for employers to step outside their comfort zones and recognize that if you want to be flexible and creative, and if you want to have a company that is the most inclusive and reaching the most amount of people, disability and that lens that comes with it is integral to building a diverse and inclusive workplace. So that's kind of, how I look at the world. And maybe you're already what I would call the converted, and you're already thinking about this. You're already acknowledging that, the people that I work with might not be as diverse or reflective of our society. And what can I do to create that? If you're showing up for this keynote, hopefully you're thinking that way. And if this is new to you, I encourage you to dig deeper and ask more questions that prompt this line of thinking that I've kind of provoked you to think about. Every person on this planet has the same desires and needs. We all want to feel a sense of belonging. We all want to feel love and joy. We all want to make an honest, equitable living, and to have a home, and to have friends and family, and to be healthy and supported. And that's nothing special, and that's nothing different than someone with a disability would want. And so I think when we think about who is fit for work, it's really important to recognize even just the lessons that COVID has taught us. Prior to the pandemic, this question of accommodation was often kind of segregated and put in a different box. If you have a disability, you may need accommodations, and, we'll give you all of the things, if we have them, that'll make, you feel accommodated and supported in the workplace. But there was one thing that kind of was really interesting that I noticed, which was a lot of people, in order to be employed or to even have access to employment, had this desire to work from home or to have flexible hours. And for the longest of times, it was considered an accommodation. It was considered something for, remote or often disabled folks, we have often advocated for this to be kind of the norm or to be part of the workplace. And with kind of the onset of the pandemic, what we saw was an entire world within the flick of a switch adapt to what the disability community has known is possible, that you can work from home, that you can be flexible with your hours, that there are many different ways to address work. And that is a very interesting learning for us. That whereas in the past it might have seemed like a special accommodation, it is now something that we have all recognized as possible. Imagine now if we were to lean into disability further, what other types of innovations, flexibility, creative decision-making could we untap if we were to think about how to apply a disability lens to work? Pretty radical if you consider the fact that, basically all the time in the past and increasingly still moving forward in the future, people still see disability as at the side. What I'm very passionate about is flipping that narrative and thinking about how accessibility, inspired and co-created by people with disabilities, can be a driving force in the work that we do, in the communities that we build, in the products, services, and experiences that we offer and create for one another. So here are a few things that you can do to be more accessible and inclusive if you are an employer. And if you are someone who's looking for work, or perhaps an ally or someone with a disability, these are also things that we can use to socialize this concept that I've been talking about. The first, and we're already doing it right now, is begin the dialogue, acknowledge the barriers, recognize that things are not currently equitable, that, unconscious bias is still at play when it comes to addressing people with disabilities. Having open and honest and sometimes difficult conversations is incredibly important to getting closer to people with different needs and abilities than our own. This helps to generate empathy. And it also helps to kind of understand things we might not be comfortable to talk about. So having conversations like this, joining networks like Discoverability, and just asking your colleagues questions or being open to change is something incredibly important to do and is an ongoing need, not something you do one time. Another thing that I think is really important to do is to evaluate the work environment. What are the tools you're using? What are the practices you're using? Are there technologies at play that perhaps are not accessible digitally? And who is able to leverage and use the kind of practices and tools that have been installed within your workplace, and who's excluded from being able to use those? I'll give you a really kind of interesting example. I was invited once to present at a boardroom meeting, and I got there early and no one else had arrived yet. And so I decided, just kind of last minute, to remove all the chairs from the room. So I was with a friend. I did not do this on my own. And we removed all the chairs from the room. And I sat kind of at the table because I brought my own wheelchair, so I was fine. And as everyone came in, people felt really displaced. They felt really uncomfortable because, first of all, this boardroom didn't look like a regular boardroom. Where were all the chairs? And secondly, the first thing people asked for were chairs. Could we get some chairs in here? And I said, happy to accommodate you, but I'm fine. Let's start the meeting. And so imagine if we had flipped the narrative on how we address and discuss the needs of people with disabilities. In that situation, I was ready to go. I didn't need accommodation. It was actually all the non-disabled people who needed the chairs, but we don't talk about chairs as a special accommodation. So why is it that some tools and technologies are considered special accommodations and others are the way in which we work? That is entirely just based on kind of thinking patterns that we've developed. And if we had just opened our minds to every person works a little differently. Some people need different needs. How can we emphasize and prioritize technologies, tools, and practices that are the most inclusive and flexible to as many people as possible? If we go into thinking about our work environments that way, we're more likely to create universally inclusive designs and experiences. And disability can often be an incredible driver to ask questions like those. Another is to evaluate the work culture. This is the invisible stuff. This is that concept of belonging. It's one thing to create accessible tools. It's one thing to invest in an accessible work environment. But how are people feeling when they come to work, whether it be remotely, online, or in person? You know, do people feel a sense of identity? Do they feel comfortable being themselves? This concept of disclosure comes up. Are people afraid to talk about their needs or difference of opinions? Or are people feeling supported by their colleagues, their managers, and anyone else within the leadership team, in which, you know, there's an acknowledgement based on those earlier conversations that it's okay to be different, it's okay to speak up, and that we're all different. We all have different needs, and there's an acknowledgement of that. You know, many people in your life may be living with disability already, and you might not even know it. And so this concept of even disclosure, which comes up so much, this is specifically in the workplaces, you know, I'm afraid to tell people that I have a disability because I don't want to be penalized. That's part of a work culture issue. I'm afraid to even identify in the application process that I might have different needs, or, you know, that I might want to work from home or have different hours or need specific technology because I'm afraid I won't get the job. How, as an organization or as an employer, can you work to signal in advance of those types of fears that you've thought about people and the diversity of kind of lived experiences that come up? Again, it goes back to dialogue. It goes back to engaging experts, talking to community groups that have lived experience to inform the way in which you design and draft your policies and your and the way in which you do work. And that leads me to another one, which is kind of evaluate your messaging and your hiring practices in general. So at Access Now, we're a small company. We're just 12 people, but every summer we kind of expand how big our company gets, and we employ people across the country to work with us on specific projects. And I remember the first time I hired someone, I had no idea really what was involved. And I didn't really think about the messaging or the tone or even the words that I used. I just said, you know, I need someone to do this task. And as I kind of, you know, learned about how to create an inclusive and accessible hiring practice, I've also learned to be intentionally descriptive, to signal to people who often might overlook a job application just because, you know, history suggests that they wouldn't be qualified. So I will intentionally put in the job description, you know, people with disabilities encouraged to apply, because for me, the specific roles that I'm looking for are best filled by people with disabilities, because we're a disability-led company. And so we're looking for that lived experience to inform the way we drive and build our products and our tech. But, you know, that might not be right for you, but think about the language that you use in your job postings and think about who has access to them. And are you posting them on traditional sites? Are you engaging, you know, organizations like Magnet and so many others that connect people who are looking for work from a disability space, and your audiences that, you know, might typically not be subscribing to that? And so kind of going out of your way and socializing concepts for employment is another way to kind of showcase your commitment to diversity and inclusive business practices. And one more that I'm going to throw in just for fun before I kind of wrap up and we'll move to questions is what I call a map mission. Now, early on when we started the Access Now company, one of the ways in which we would engage people to kind of go out with us and map their communities, and honestly, it was just an early way to share information about places on the Access Now app, was through this concept of a map mission. Basically, what a map mission is it brings people together, sometimes dispersed virtually over space, and sometimes in an actual destination or a community or even an intersection in a city, anywhere. It brings people together is the bottom line. And we have one task to map buildings and spaces based on accessibility. And originally we did this with people with disabilities, and then we invited friends and families and colleagues, and eventually we started working with schools, and we've also worked with many businesses to encourage people to do the same, to think about the world, about the accessibility of the world, and often what's missing from that equation. And so we work with employers to engage their own workforces, to have an opportunity to internalize and experience, what it's like to navigate spaces and consistently need to ask questions about whether or not you'll be included, whether or not there will be an accessible entrance, whether or not there is an accessible washroom with specific features, whether or not there's an automatic door. There are so many questions that go in, right? And so through the app, basically people are prompted to ask these questions, to go across the street at the place you get lunch every day and say, wait a minute, is this space actually accessible? And to who? And so really the bottom line is you're welcome to do a map mission if you'd like. If you want more information, I'm happy to share. But mostly the lesson in that is find a way within your workplace to get away from the desk and to have a tangible experience. Because when you do that, it will completely change the way and perspective you look. And by the way, one tangible experience is having a child and pushing a stroller. I can't tell you how many people have told me, I never thought about accessibility until I had to navigate the subway system with a stroller. So that is a tangible experience that changes your perspective on accessibility forever. Hopefully I've made that connection for you if you haven't yet, and you have been in that position, but there are many, many others. And so I encourage you to think of ways to have tangible experiences that ask you to question or think about the world from the perspective that I've shared a bit about today, and engage people with lived experience of disability. I will leave you with this. Within the disability community, we say nothing about us without us. I would say nothing without us, period. And if we're going to develop inclusive workplaces, policies, companies, products, services, it's not enough to host a round table or have a group, on their lunch break talk about something. It's important to acknowledge the expertise that people with disabilities carry. It's important to provide that space and invest intentionally if you're going to actually strive to achieve authentic representation and inclusion. So thank you for allowing me to take some time and share. It's difficult to sit still and just listen to a screen for so long, so I really appreciate it. And I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to share a bit about my personal experience and hopefully give you some tidbits to leave you wanting more. Happy to open up the floor for some questions. And again, thank you so much.
Maayan, that was a very interesting speech. We appreciate your time. While the audience perhaps thinks about questions and has their questions typed into the Q&A. I know there's one there already. I just wanted to comment on how interesting it was that your survival skills developed in years of development were adapted to entrepreneurship. And consequently, perhaps, or at least what the feeling that I got is that as a result of that, the business model you developed specifically looks to facilitate the reality or the need for businesses to tap into, more of the market. We know how much of the market people with disabilities and their loved ones and close relations control. It's over 50%, but as well as the labor pool that is represented by people with disabilities. And I appreciated your comments about reframing the conversation around accommodations, because often accommodations for people with disabilities is considered apart from the rest of the accommodations conversation. When we talk about things like religious practices, personal family care, child care, WSIB, but really it's all the same thing. And then the boardroom stunt with chairs is brilliant. My colleague Lisa will know I'm stealing an example from a professional colleague of ours who talks about lights being accommodations for people with sight. So I think just changing the way we think about those things is a great way to proceed. Having said that, there are questions, and the first one that I want to share with you is, what helps employers and employees have discussions around disabilities that are hidden? Can these discussions happen in a dignified way? And if yes, what are some suggestions?
Yes. Okay. Thanks for the question. I would say that one of the first things to build upon before you get into, the harder stuff is a sense of safety and trust. A lot of people want to just jump into the hard stuff and talk about disability and kind of a lot of the things I've talked about today, but it really starts with creating a space where people feel comfortable to talk about their fears and to share their experiences. And there's no real easy way to do that. I was reading Satya Nadella's book, the CEO of Microsoft, about kind of what he acknowledged in the work culture when he took on the role, and the need to develop trust and empathy before kind of addressing, challenges in the work, or, people speaking over others, or kind of any of the things that come up. And so I'd say, really it starts with the acknowledgement and desire to do that. There are many amazing kind of facilitators, contractors, consultants that can do and work with companies to kind of establish the sense of workplace culture and belonging. And I think it shouldn't really actually be just about disability. Really, for me, every person is different. Every person has a different lens and a different way of seeing the world. Some voices, some experiences have been prioritized within our world, and there are many who don't feel a sense of place or power or purpose within the work place. And so it starts with establishing trust and belonging. And so that could be something as simple as asking, really small questions about people's lives, people's experiences, having the opportunity, to have kind of an open conversation about childhood, or, there's many different ways that we do it, like share a story, where you felt like there was something you couldn't do and why, and how you persevered through that. So there are many ways in which people are comfortable being a bit more vulnerable. And this is a bit of the softer stuff, but I think it starts with that. It starts with people feeling comfortable and safe to kind of shed the shield that we often carry. And it takes time. It takes a lot of time. There's no quick and easy fix to doing that.
I think the acknowledgement of the lack of a magic bullet is an important one. So thank you for that. There are more questions. The next one up is anonymous attendee. Literally, that's what it says. So I can actually say their name. Make sure my hand's in the camera. I'm curious to know if there was an entrepreneurship accelerator program you tapped into. Also, I love the boardroom stunt. Any other examples of good exercises?
So I didn't do any specific entrepreneurship accelerator. I have been through a few tech accelerators, and I'm pretty sure that I've been the only person, definitely with a physical or visible disability. There are some programs that have that I've noticed over the last little while that are more geared specifically to disability entrepreneurship. And actually, I think that there's an incredible opportunity to invest in more of that programming. So even if you just follow on my LinkedIn, I share a lot of different job opportunities and accelerator programs. And if that's interesting to you, happy to share more resources as they come up for me. The second question, I think, was about practices to kind of highlight the narrative of why we organize people in one group versus another. And you can have just a lot of fun with that. I'd say that one thing very important to do, and it's quite controversial because people have different opinions on it, but I never try to appropriate someone else's experience. I will never suggest that sitting in a wheelchair is the same for a lunch break is the same as someone's entire life living in a wheelchair. And actually, and that's just one example. But the reason for doing that, and again, this is just my personal perspective, is that I think that it actually doesn't do justice to people who have that lived experience, and that it's more important to find ways to act as allies than it is to play dress up. So I know, controversial. Hello, that's who I am. But I'd say when you think about ways to create experiences, think about ways where people can still show up authentically and be honest and real, and not need to kind of pretend or do something else in order to unlock some of the findings and kind of discussions that I've talked about. And I know that's still vague, but it could be something like ramp building with stopgap. It could be something like a map mission. There are many ways. It could be a hackathon. There are many ways in which you can kind of engage groups to have experiences that doesn't kind of edge on, I have to pretend to be like that person to understand their life.
I think it's a great point calling out the controversy and the need to push the envelope. Anyone familiar with the economic ideas of creative destruction, I'm sure will appreciate that. We do have another question. I'm currently struggling with the term disabled. I'm not disabled, but I work with the community, supporting and writing resources, etc. I'm always aware of language. I feel as though something may be changing in terms of the culture of language, and I'm wondering if you feel the same, where you feel it's at, and what the best practice is.
Yeah, language is a big one. And, you could have an entire seminar just on language itself. I will say from my perspective, disability is not a dirty word. Growing up, I did not want to call myself disabled. And often, if you're feeling not sure about it, leading with person first language or person with a disability is always, in my opinion, a safe space. But, it is personal, and some people do not feel comfortable identifying as disabled. But I would dig deeper on that and ask why. Why are people uncomfortable identifying as disabled or saying the word? Why is there this kind of ickiness about just the language? If we can't find equitable language just to talk about an issue, how are we going to get deeper and talk about the hard stuff? And so language is constantly changing. It's forever evolving. And as we kind of move into the future, I'm sure it will continue to do so. There's kind of this reclaiming of the word disabled. And from my perspective, when I say I am a disabled person, it is part of my identity, because as I shared kind of even in the opening of my talk today, I am disabled by my surroundings. I am disabled by the kind of societal norms that have been put in place that have not prioritized my needs and my experiences. I am disabled when I show up at an entrance that has 3 steps as opposed to a ramp. And that's a design choice. That is a decision that someone or some organization made that did not include me. And so if there were to be a ramp there, if there were to be an automatic door there, I would not feel disabled by that environment. I would be included. And until we get to a point where, you know, every space is inclusive and accessible, I will consistently have that friction and that tension between kind of the world and the society around me and myself. And I would say that there is a difference between being part of the disability population and being part of the disability community. Not every person with a disability will be comfortable or want to be part of the community, to be part of conversations like this one. And not every person with a disability wants to be an expert on disability or accessibility. They could be into sports or fashion or journalism or, you know, anything else. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're not all here to help non-disabled people figure out how to make the world accessible. Although we have a lot of expertise, often it's not something that every person wants to do. So acknowledging that as well is an interesting conversation to have. Anyway, okay, I've talked a lot. Hopefully that answered your question, and thank you for asking it.
I'm sure it did. That was very thorough and considered. I have a question of my own, to be honest. From your perspective, there are so many different accessibility options out there and considerations to make. How can businesses prioritize which ones to pursue?
Yeah, that is a hard one. I would say start with something. You can't do everything, and even within my company, you know, but even starting with digital accessibility, which is a little bit more flexible and definitely online. You know, you can do it from anywhere. You don't have to rip down a building, and it's quite low in cost to start that conversation. Is a really interesting exercise to start asking questions about accessibility. So if you have a digital storefront, if you have a website of any kind, asking questions about whether or not that is an accessible website. You know, I think it's roughly 10% of the internet is actually digitally accessible, which is really low. If you consider how much of our world is digital and how much we engage online. So, you know, and what digitally accessible means is that it's flexible and responsive to things like screen readers, you know, that you have right color contrast, that you have alt text on images, that you have buttons that are labeled correctly, and that someone who is non-sighted can still use your tech, your website, your app, your whatever, and still actually do so successfully. So I always like to prompt people to start with digital accessibility because it's quite accessible to be able to start that conversation. There are a lot of companies and tools and online resources to get you going. Even companies like Microsoft and Apple who've really been year after year pushing the envelope on kind of how to define and how to do that. There's a lot of innovation in that space right now. So that's usually one way to start. The second that I'll mention is language. So the conversation we just had, the question posed about language, look at what terms you are using within your organization to talk about disability. And if it, you know, includes any type of signaling that would unintentionally exclude people, and it could be special needs or differently abled, or I'm not even going to continue down the list, that signals to some people, my favorite, wheelchair bound, that some people are better or different than others, that's already a signal that there's some work that needs to be done before you get even to, you know, how you're going to address some of the inequities and the barriers. So consult with people who know this, learn directly from people with lived experience, and you'll be well on your way.
Thank you for that. I know it was a difficult question. I really enjoyed the beginning of it, to be honest, especially the just start with something. I think you definitely, getting started is often the most difficult part of any enterprise. There is one more question in the Q&A. We only have 2 more minutes, so I will read it rather quickly and give you a chance to respond. What would you say would be best practices in shifting mindset from reactive to proactive when it comes to authentic accessibility in the workplace that is sustainable, and to what outreach could they then provide to encourage others to pivot in that direction?
Yeah. This is something I think about a lot, and within our company at Access Now, this is one of the things we do with business owners, is we help people kind of what I call own the narrative, and not be in this constant reactive position where someone, files a complaint or says that your company isn't accessible, or, worse, lawsuits, whatever. There's a lot that can come up when you sit in the reactive space. What it also doesn't allow you to do is take the time to consider how to develop something that's inclusive. Being proactive starts with asking the questions, and putting in place a plan, and also creating accountability and transparency about that plan. So don't just host a roundtable. The roundtable is good, but unless you have the next steps and you have people in leadership positions who have signed up and said, I make this pledge, I will make sure that by X date we have a fully digitally accessible and compliant website. By this date, we will set targets for better representation of disabled employees within our work culture. Set targets for yourself, and they could start small, but set targets that are achievable and a little bit beyond reach, so that you work hard, just like you would on any business goal, to actually achieve them. And so I would say that's one of the first things you can do, is just treat it like anything else that you would do as a business just to achieve success. If you want to grow your profits, you set targets, you create a plan. There are certain people who are accountable to reaching certain milestones. If you want to, do anything within your company, create a comms plan, you do the same thing. Yet accessibility is not seen that way or in that light. And it could and it should. Because once you start doing that, once you treat it as part of the design and decision-making process of everything you do, it starts to drive the innovation on how your company works and how your company grows. And so that's what I would say. That's what we do as a company, and it's completely changed even just my outlook as a person with a disability on what it means to be an inclusive employer.
Well, you did an excellent job responding to that question in a very short period of time. Thank you for that. I am impressed. And thank you for your time this morning. It was great to open our event with you as our keynote. We certainly appreciate you being here with us and sharing your insights. And we hope that we will see you at future events of ours.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
My pleasure.